The room was still, a silence so heavy it pressed against the wooden walls of the Providence courtroom. Fluorescent lights hummed faintly overhead, but no one noticed. All eyes were fixed on a frail man shifting nervously at the defendant's stand. His name was Ziggy Quinn. His hands trembled just enough for the papers he held to rattle, betraying the fear he tried to swallow. He cleared his throat, but the sound cracked in half like a splintered branch. Behind the bench, Judge Frank Caprio adjusted his glasses and leaned forward. He was 87 years old, and this, unbeknownst to many in that room, was the final case of his long career. His presence carried a warm dignity that contrasted sharply with the cold formality of law books piled on his desk. Every wrinkle on his face seemed etched by decades of not just judgments, but mercies. And today, those decades weighed in his voice as he softly asked, "Mr. Quinn, tell me what brings you here." The question was simple, but for Ziggy it felt like the ground opening beneath him. He spoke haltingly, describing the unpaid fines, the medical struggles that drained his savings, the weight of living as if the system only knew how to press harder on the already vulnerable. His words quivered in the still air, yet they landed like thunder within every heart present. Caprio did not interrupt. He did not hurry the man. Instead, he peered over his glasses with a gaze that belonged less to a judge and more to a grandfather trying desperately to understand. In that single moment, time itself seemed to slow. A courtroom, usually reserved for sterile legality, was suddenly transformed into a stage where humanity was the only script. Whispers rippled briefly through the back rows, hushed immediately by the gravity of the moment. The prosecutor shifted, glancing at papers but unable to escape the tightening knot in the air. Something historic was forming just beyond words, something beyond verdicts or fines. And then, with one line, just one, the atmosphere broke open. Judge Caprio leaned closer and said, "This may be the last case I ever sit on." Gasps fluttered across the benches. Eyes widened. What he chose to do next would not only define this man's fate, it would echo as the very measure of his legacy. But the real reason the moment broke hearts goes far deeper than anyone expected. For most people, a traffic fine is little more than an inconvenience, a slip of paper tucked under a windshield wiper, shrugged off, or angrily stuffed in the glove compartment. But for Ziggy Quinn, this wasn't just about a ticket or the tally of unpaid penalties. His crumpled summons reflected a lifetime of relentless weight pressing down. It carried the echoes of bills overdue, medication costs that stacked higher than rent, and days when choosing between feeding himself and paying another fine wasn't a choice at all. It was survival. Ziggy didn't walk into that courtroom as a careless driver who ignored the rules. He walked in as a man who had struggled to keep standing while the system repeatedly tugged at his knees. His frail appearance, the way his hands shook as he reached for words, they weren't signs of defeat. They were signs of someone who had lived too long with the feeling of being unseen. And this is why the stakes crackled in that courtroom, with invisible electricity. Because sitting at the bench, across the polished wood that carried decades of verdicts and sentences, was Frank Caprio. He was more than just a judge. He had become a symbol. For years, audiences across America, and across the globe, had watched clips of his courtroom encounters on television and online. Clips where compassion triumphed over rigidity, where a parking fine wasn't just a parking fine, but an opportunity to see humanity in action. But today was different. This wasn't another viral clip waiting to happen. This was his final case. Millions didn't know it yet, but in that moment, those four walls held the weight of a farewell, not just to a man but to an ideal. And when ideals are faced with one last test, everything sharpens. The meaning of justice, the dignity of mercy, the strands of a life's work converging into a single decision. Ziggy's stammer, his nervous breath, and his humbled eyes seemed to mirror every person who had ever felt crushed by rules that had no softness. Sitting across from him, Caprio's legacy hung in the balance like a fragile thread. Was the law cold, impartial, untouchable? Or could the law bend toward mercy without breaking? The audience could feel it. The tension wasn't just between an elderly man facing a fine and a judge flipping through paperwork. It was between two visions of America itself. One vision, rigid and unforgiving, punished struggle as if it were a crime. The other vision, the one embodied by Caprio at his best, recognized that struggle is human, and humanity deserves dignity. And so, every pause carried weight. Every glance between judge and defendant felt like centuries of arguments about justice condensed into a single silent exchange. A courtroom often seen as ordinary became, for a single morning, the battleground for something extraordinary. The eternal clash between compassion and control. This is why people leaned forward, why the hushed silence had the richness of a church ceremony. It wasn't theater, it was truth. It wasn't a mere ruling, it was legacy, standing tall in its final hour. As Ziggy's voice grew softer, almost breaking, Judge Caprio's eyes glistened with something more than professionalism. Those watching that morning felt it before it was spoken. This was no ordinary case, and the decision wouldn't just determine fines, it would define what his life's service truly meant. Yet no one realized how personal this case would become. Not even Judge Caprio himself. Every story needs a villain, but sometimes the villain doesn't wear a scowl or slam a fist on the table. Sometimes the villain isn't even human. In Judge Caprio's courtroom, the true antagonist wasn't another attorney or rival politician. It was a machine, an enormous, invisible machine called the system. The system had no face, but everyone who walked into that courtroom had felt its weight. Cold bureaucracy, black and white statutes, tickets that multiplied like weeds after rain. Each one demanding payment in ink, each one indifferent to the circumstances of those who received it. To the system, a single mother chasing 3 jobs was no different than a careless millionaire. A man recovering from surgery was lumped in with someone who parked selfishly. Its hand was steady, mechanical, and utterly unrelenting. Day after day, citations slid across counters. Late fees accrued like small punishments that sprouted new punishments. A $25 violation could, within weeks, metastasize into $200 of crushing debt. For the working poor, those numbers represented the difference between a week's groceries or medicine. Yet to the system, numbers were just numbers. Red ink fed into spreadsheets, another statistic added to annual reports. What made it cruel was not intent, but indifference. There was no malice in the printout of a ticket, no evil grin in the envelope stamped notice of violation. But indifference, in its own quiet way, often hurts more than hatred. At least hatred acknowledges you exist. Indifference says you're invisible. And the greatest humiliation is to be rendered unseen, reduced to nothing more than a slip of paper waiting to be processed. Generations of immigrants, workers, mothers, and veterans had stood trembling before that indifference. They were not criminals, but the system treated them as if dignity could be itemized, filed, and penalized. These were families who packed lunch in reused bags, children who watched their parents cut pills in half to stretch prescriptions, all suddenly weighed down because their meter had blinked red 20 minutes too early. The courtroom had become an assembly line of these human stories. Each day people shuffled in with envelopes of unpaid fines, ashamed glances, defeated sighs. They carried not only debt but also the psychic burden of living under watchful eyes that punished mistakes far harsher than victories were ever rewarded. What chance did anyone have against a machine programmed for efficiency, not empathy? This was the villain. Rules without mercy. Like a towering wall without a single crack to climb, the bureaucracy loomed. And though it spoke in legal documents and penalty notices instead of angry words, its message was clear. Bend or break, comply or crumble. Judge Caprio knew this villain well. He had seen it grind down ordinary people for decades. He had watched shame ache across their faces as they tried to explain why their fines piled up, knowing that explanations rarely moved the invisible gears of the machine. The cruelty was subtle, but it was absolute. Consider Ziggy's situation. A man who already carried the load of fragile health and fragile finances, suddenly dragged into a world where compassion did not exist on the balance sheet. The system didn't care if he had doctor's appointments. It didn't care that his medicine cost more than his paycheck, and it certainly didn't care that, when confronted with impossible choices, he always chose survival first. Against bureaucracy, survival was irrelevant. The bill was due. That is why people gasped when Caprio reminded the court this could be his last case. Because they knew a machine would never say those words. A machine has no last day on the bench, no farewell, no years of service to reflect on. But a man does, and a man can choose. Still, in this moment before the surprise of compassion, the system loomed like a shadow. It claimed authority over Ziggy's life. It claimed the right to label him irresponsible, to humiliate, to extract. It played the role of villain with chilling precision. No malice, no mercy, only rules. Everyone in that courtroom knew what the machine demanded. It demanded money that Ziggy did not have. It demanded shame he did not deserve. It demanded obedience to a pattern older than justice itself. And if not for the man peering over his glasses, if not for the humanity at the bench, Ziggy Quinn would have been left crushed under its weight. But this story was not only about the system. It was about what happened when one fragile man faced it not as a number, but as a human being with a story too heavy to ignore. And then sitting across from that system was one man whose life told a very different story, Ziggy Quinn. Ziggy Quinn never imagined his life would end up on display in a courtroom, trembling under fluorescent lights, his private struggles, becoming public record. To the casual observer, he was simply another man with unpaid parking fines. But beneath the surface, Ziggy's story was richer, heavier, and far more symbolic, because it carried the weight of countless others who had walked the same hard road. Ziggy lived in the quiet margins of society, not because he wanted to, but because systems had nudged him there again and again. He battled declining health that left him frail, often too exhausted to keep pace with the endless demands of survival. Pills and doctor visits consumed not only his strength but his savings. The meager income he did scrape together barely stretched to cover rent and food. And when you live life, one emergency away from disaster, something as small as a parking ticket can become an avalanche. Still, Ziggy carried himself with a quiet dignity. He didn't storm into Judge Caprio's courtroom with defiance. He entered with humility. To many, that resilience is invisible. But to those who have lived it, survival without bitterness is its own form of heroism. Ziggy's eyes that morning weren't filled with excuses. They were filled with exhaustion. Yes, but also with the stubborn pride of someone who refused to stop trying. That's why his story resonated instantly. It wasn't just about him. It was about millions of people who drag themselves out of bed every day despite impossible odds, hoping the world will see their humanity instead of their mistakes. And then, across from Ziggy, sat a man shaped by his own struggles. Judge Frank Caprio. His story began in a very different time, but the echoes were unmistakable. Born in Providence, the son of immigrant parents from Italy, Frank grew up knowing what it meant to have little but family and faith. His father was a fruit peddler, a man whose calloused hands spoke of sacrifice, who taught his children that dignity had nothing to do with wealth and everything to do with compassion. Young Frank watched his parents endure humiliation familiar to every immigrant family, accents mocked, sacrifices overlooked, opportunities always rationed. But instead of hardening, the boy grew tender. He saw that rules without kindness broke people. He learned, almost instinctively, that law without mercy could never equal justice. That seed, planted in his childhood, would eventually sprout in his courtroom, where countless defendants like Ziggy discovered that behind the robe sat not just a judge, but a man who remembered his own family's struggles. Caprio's rise was steady but never divorced from those roots. He worked as a teacher, a lawyer, a community servant, before ascending to the bench. Unlike so many who let power polish away empathy, Caprio carried his family's lessons into every gavel strike. That's why, over the years, his courtroom became legendary. It wasn't just a place where infractions were weighed, it was a stage, where compassion took shape as policy, moment by moment, case by case. And now, fate placed Ziggy Quinn in that courtroom, across that bench. Two men whose lives seemed different in every visible way, one trembling from poverty's grip. The other, robed as the arbiter of law, suddenly found themselves mirrors of one another. Because beneath the differences, their stories aligned. Both had walked through worlds that underestimated them, worlds that often punished weakness rather than recognized dignity. That convergence created sparks not of conflict, but of recognition. Caprio could see in Ziggy the faces of his father and neighbors, those who had struggled while trying to maintain their self-respect in a society that too often confused wealth with worth. Ziggy, perhaps without realizing it, was reminding Caprio of where he came from and why he had chosen a life where mercy mattered. This is why the moment felt larger than life. It wasn't about one fine or one hearing. It was about a man marked by health struggles and hardship meeting, in his most vulnerable hour, a judge whose entire philosophy had stemmed from his own family's journey through hardship. Two parallel narratives intersected under the weight of finality, Caprio's last case, Ziggy's latest struggle, and that collision was transforming what could have been routine into the unforgettable. In Ziggy, the everyman lives, quiet suffering, resilience uncelebrated, dignity intact despite bruises. In Caprio, the compassionate arbiter reigns, firm when necessary but soft where humanity demands it, a man who spent his career choosing justice defined by empathy rather than technicality. Together, they embody the eternal struggle, people caught in systems too large versus leaders courageous enough to see their humanity. And so the stakes sharpened. When Ziggy's voice quavered as he explained his situation, it struck a chord, because Caprio had heard stories like it all his life. But this time it was different. This was not just another case to file away. This was the final note in a lifetime symphony of compassion. How Caprio acted with Ziggy would not only shape that man's life, it would etch into memory what Frank Caprio stood for as a judge and as a human being. The courtroom held its breath because it knew something extraordinary had entered those walls. The intertwining of two destinies, the symbolic clash of hardship and compassion meeting in one fragile moment. It was the story of America itself. Immigrant dreams and working-class struggle merged in the crucible of law. Everything in Ziggy's life led to this moment, and everything in Frank Caprio's career was about to be defined by it. The tension in the room had shifted. The casual murmurs that usually filled the gaps of courtroom proceedings had evaporated, leaving behind only the sound of Ziggy Quinn's uneven breathing as he attempted to explain himself. His voice was hesitant, fragile, like an old radio, signal flickering in and out. "Your Honor," he began, clutching the crumpled papers in his hand as if they were a lifeline. I wasn't trying to run from responsibility. I've been sick. I've been trying to keep up." The words were jagged, disconnected, but the meaning cut deep. Ziggy wasn't pleading with anger. He was pleading with exhaustion. Each sentence sounded as if it had been dragged uphill, battered by years of hardship before making its way into the courtroom. Judge Frank Caprio listened silently, eyes fixed on the defendant. He leaned back slightly, but every so often he leaned forward again, like a man leaning closer not to intimidate, but to hear the truth beneath the struggle. The law books stacked on his bench loomed like silent sentinels. Their message was clear. Fines are fines. Rules are rules. And if the judge chose to enforce them to the letter, then Ziggy was cornered with nowhere to turn. "Tell me about your situation," Caprio said finally, his voice both gentle and firm. It wasn't a question. It was a command disguised in mercy. Ziggy hesitated, swallowed hard, and pressed on. "My health hasn't been good. Treatments, medications. Sometimes I couldn't make it to work, and when work hours dropped, so did my paycheck. One missed payment turned into two. Then, I couldn't keep up with the tickets. I tried to fix it, I really did. But when you fall behind, it's like the bills chase faster than you can run." The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably in their chair, papers rustling. The details were stark, undeniable. Yet the system demanded that numbers on a page outweigh the man standing in front of them. Caprio cleared his throat. "Mr. Quinn, how many tickets are we dealing with here?" Ziggy's shoulders slumped as if the very question pressed another weight onto his chest. "Too many," he said softly. "More than I can pay. I wasn't careless. I was just trying to stay alive." There it was, the clash made visible. On one side of the bench, the rules, rigid and impersonal. On the other, a man revealing his vulnerability, asking not for pity but for recognition. The courtroom itself seemed to pulse with the silent duel between system and story. Caprio tapped his pen lightly against the desk, a small rhythm that only heightened the suspense. He adjusted his glasses again, this time peering not just over them, but through them, as if searching for something unspoken in Ziggy's eyes. "And, you understand," Caprio replied slowly, "that the law is not simply suggestion. It has to be respected, even when the burden feels unfair." "Yes, Your Honor," Ziggy whispered. "I respect it. I hoped maybe you could understand. Me too." In that instant, the gravity doubled. The plea was no longer about tickets, it was about dignity. Every immigrant, every working-class parent, every marginalized voice who had ever stood defeated before rules without compassion could feel their own words echoing in Ziggy's statement. The moment stretched taut, as if the air itself refused to move until the judge spoke again. The silence became cinematic, the kind that demands the world lean in. Spectators in the gallery tightened their grips on purses, hands, forearms, unwilling to miss a syllable. Caprio leaned in, voice lower, slower, more deliberate. "So you're asking me to weigh more than just numbers on a page?" Ziggy raised his head, eyes glassy, and nodded once. The stalemate froze in time. Would the unforgiving rigidity of the system slam down with finality, or would compassion bend the rules without shattering them? Hearts beat faster in the stillness, the suspense curling around everyone present. And then, with a pause heavy enough to rattle the soul, Judge Caprio opened his mouth to speak. The next words out of Caprio's mouth would silence the room. The silence before Judge Caprio spoke was unlike any silence that had come before. It carried weight, like a rope straining, under the pull of two opposing forces, unyielding law on one side, fragile humanity on the other. And everyone, every lawyer, every clerk, every person in the gallery, understood that this moment was about to tilt one way or the other. Caprio's eyes stayed locked on Ziggy Quinn, who gripped his papers like a shipwrecked sailor clinging to driftwood. The old judge let the pause stretch because in that pause the truth breathed. Ziggy's shoulders sagged, as if preparing for whatever verdict would land. The courtroom braced for bureaucracy's hammer. Then Caprio leaned forward, ever so slightly, and let out a measured breath. His voice was soft, but it cut through the room with more force than a gavel. "Mr. Quinn," he said, "I've heard many stories in this courtroom. Some of them are angry, some of them are excuses, and some are simply pleas for mercy. But what strikes me about yours is not the mistakes you've made. It's the dignity you've managed to hold on to despite everything weighing you down." Ziggy blinked, his mouth parting but unable to form a response. He hadn't expected acknowledgement. He'd expected judgment. Caprio continued, his hand hovering over the paperwork like an executioner choosing whether to bring down the blade. "The law must be enforced, that's true. We cannot live in a society without rules because rules hold us together. But what are rules worth if they come at the expense of justice? What good is the law if it crushes a man already bowed by hardship?" The words rose and fell like orchestral notes, every sentence tightening throats in the gallery. Caprio paused, his eyes glistening as he straightened in his chair. His voice trembled, not from uncertainty, but from the unbearable gravity of knowing this might be the final time he delivered a ruling with the full weight of compassion. "This is my last case, and I refuse to let it end with cruelty." A collective gasp spread like a wave. Those words carried power beyond legal authority. They carried legacy. People leaned forward, even the prosecutor, as if realizing history had just stepped into the room. Caprio lowered his eyes to the papers one last time before setting them aside, almost deliberately dismissing the paperwork as irrelevant. He looked straight at Ziggy. "I'm not going to let the system bury you under numbers. I'm going to forgive these fines." The room cracked open. Gasps, muffled cries, even the shuffle of shoes as people turned to each other in disbelief. Someone in the back covered their face. Even seasoned court clerks shifted uncomfortably, fighting emotion. "And Ziggy?" Ziggy froze, his mouth trembling as words failed him. Caprio spoke again, this time softer, the quaver in his voice undeniable. You remind me of my father. A man who worked himself to the bone, who carried burdens with quiet dignity that most people never even saw. He was not defined by what he couldn't pay. And neither are you. Tears, uninvited and unashamed, welled in the corners of the judge's eyes. The courtroom, always a stage for restraint and rigid decorum, had transformed into a sanctuary. Nobody dared to breathe too loudly, as if exhaling might collapse the fragile sanctity of the moment. Ziggy finally tried to speak. Judge, I don't know what to... His voice cracked mid-sentence, breaking under the tidal wave of relief and disbelief. His hands shook so violently the papers slipped from his grasp and fluttered to the floor. He lowered his head, pressing his eyes shut as tears streamed freely down his lined cheeks. Caprio nodded softly, as though granting permission for that reaction. He didn't scold. He didn't rush the moment. His pause said more than stern rulings ever could. This is your space to feel, to heal, to breathe again. It was the mic drop, not of vengeance or argument, but of compassion wielded like a sword that cleaved through bureaucracy's cold indifference. And it struck harder, deeper, more lastingly than any punishment ever could. In that instant, Caprio transformed law itself. No longer a machine grinding down the vulnerable, it became a vessel of humanity. To generations endlessly bruised by systems, this was proof. The law could bend toward mercy without breaking its legitimacy. And the effect was cinematic. Reporters whispered to each other, eyes wide. A woman in the gallery dabbed her face with a tissue, openly sobbing. Even stony bailiffs cleared their throats a little too often. It wasn't just legal history. It was human history being written with tears instead of ink. Caprio raised a hand gently, closing the moment with the solemnity of a benediction. Mr. Quinn, he said, go in peace. And remember, you are not a failure. You are a man who has endured much, and today you leave with dignity intact. The room broke, whispers turning into a swelling hum. Ziggy tried once more to thank him, but the words caught in his throat. He could only nod, trembling as if the sheer relief was too much for his frame to handle. For the first time in a long time. The crushing weight was lifted, if only for a moment. And that was enough. Caprio leaned back, hands resting on the bench. His face was wet, unhidden. There was no shame in it. Tears in that courtroom were not weakness. They were testimony. They were the ultimate evidence. Truth delivered not in affidavits or exhibits, but in human connection. Everyone thought the story had ended. Everyone believed they had just witnessed the final act. Mercy delivered, justice redefined, a legacy sealed. The room buzzed with awe, bracing itself to rise and leave with the image of Frank Caprio's last ruling forever etched in memory. But just as people began to collect themselves, just as Ziggy prepared to step back with trembling hands and wet eyes, Judge Caprio leaned forward once more. His voice, quieter but sharper than ever, sliced through the hum. And just when everyone thought the story was over, Caprio revealed one last shock. The ruling had barely left Judge Frank Caprio's lips before the shockwaves began rippling outward. By the time Ziggy Quinn shuffled out of that courtroom with tears still glistening on his cheeks, someone's cell phone camera had already captured the moment and posted it online. Within minutes, the clip was spreading. First in Providence, then across the East Coast, then across the entire nation like wildfire consuming dry grass. This was no ordinary courtroom video. Unlike the routine snippets of guilty pleas and murmured fines, this one contained everything. The trembling plea of a man on the margins, a legendary judge with tears in his eyes, and a gavel transformed into a symbol of mercy. It was a raw, human drama that felt cinematic, and because it was real, it landed even harder. By noon, hashtags had surfaced. #justice with compassion. #Caprio farewell. #dignity wins. Screens glowed with praise from people who had once felt invisible themselves. A veteran posted, "I've stood in that same courtroom, terrified of being crushed by rules I couldn't keep up with. Today, Judge Caprio gave us all a voice." A single mother commented, "I cried watching this because it could have been me, working 3 jobs and still falling behind. Thank you, Judge, for reminding the world we matter. An immigrant father uploaded his own video, his accent heavy but his conviction unshakable. This judge, he sees our humanity. That is America to me. The story stepped outside the courtroom and onto digital main streets. TikTok exploded with edits scored to swelling music. Slowing the instant, Caprio said, "This is my last case, and I refuse to let it end with cruelty." Millions watched on loop. Captions like "Legendary," "Humanity still exists when law has a heart." Teens reenacted the scene in skits. Artists drew portraits of the judge and Ziggy shaking hands, circulating them with the tagline, "Compassion is." The real verdict. Even memes found their way into the cultural bloodstream. Caprio's stern face edited into superhero posters. Ziggy holding a shield labeled "Dignity." Captions calling him the people's judge. But the levity did not undercut the seriousness. It amplified it. Humor was just another vehicle for reverence. Cable networks grabbed the footage next. Commentators clashed dramatically on split screens. One called it justice at its most noble, while another tried to downplay it as symbolic but ineffectual. Yet the voices of ordinary people, the chorus on social media, overpowered pundits. Because this wasn't an abstract policy debate, it was embodied compassion, visible and undeniable. By the end of the day, the Providence courtroom had transformed into a global pulpit. Caprio's tearful words were quoted by activists who had spent decades fighting for criminal justice reform. Civil rights groups uploaded the video with captions like, "This is what mercy looks like in practice." Churches played it on giant screens during Sunday sermons. College professors cited it as a modern parable of restorative justice. And the comments kept pouring in, each one carrying the rhythm of validation long denied. Veterans, teachers, nurses, delivery drivers, immigrants, queer kids, grandmothers, all declaring the same thing in different words. "We see ourselves in Ziggy. We wish every judge carried Caprio's heart." For a nation so often exhausted by stories of corruption, cruelty, and systems swallowing the weakest whole, this case struck a different chord. It stoked something audiences often fear is gone for good: hope. Here, finally, was a moment where dignity wasn't theory, it was practice. Justice wasn't weaponized, it was humanized. And like all truly viral moments, the camera lingered not on the spectacle, but on the humanity. The tremble in Ziggy's voice, the tears brimming in Caprio's eyes, the audible gasp from the crowd. These were not mere images. They were evidence that compassion could trend faster than outrage, that mercy could be celebrated louder than cruelty. Soon, even celebrities weighed in. A famous athlete tweeted, "Strength is not how hard you hit, it's how kind you are when you don't have to be. Judge Caprio is proof." A chart-topping singer shared the video with the caption, "This is why we fight for a better world." The impact was undeniable. A small courtroom in Rhode Island had become the nucleus of a global conversation. It wasn't about parking tickets anymore. It was about whether systems should serve people or punish them. It was about what kind of nation America wanted to be remembered as. And still, under all the virality, one truth remained. It was Caprio himself, his final ruling, his cracking voice, his unapologetic tears, that imbued this moment with eternal resonance. For him, this case was never about attention or headlines. It was about the very soul of justice. The story was being told and retold, reshaped into captions, hashtags, and memes. But there was one thread everyone sensed but hadn't yet heard directly. Beyond the tears, beyond the legal forgiveness, beyond the social media frenzy, there was a message deeper and more enduring. It was the message Judge Caprio himself wanted the whole world to walk away with. But beyond the headlines, there was one message Judge Caprio wanted the world to carry forward. When the courtroom emptied and the headlines began to scatter across the globe, Judge Frank Caprio sat quietly at his bench, lingering for just a moment longer. It wasn't the wood of the chair or the gavel in his hand that mattered. It was what they had symbolized. For more than half a century, these tools of justice had been entrusted to him, and through them, he had chosen not the path of cold enforcement, but of living compassion. And now, in his final act, he reflected, not just on Ziggy Quinn's trembling words, but on all the faces that had come before him. Faces of immigrants trying to find footing. Faces of single mothers caught between survival and expectation. Faces of proud veterans whose service hadn't shielded them from financial struggle. They had entered his courtroom weighted with shame, but many walked away lighter because one judge believed law should lift, not crush. Caprio's philosophy was deceptively simple, yet profoundly radical in its purity. The law should serve people, not punish them into despair. Rules without humanity are brittle. They fracture under the weight of their own indifference. But rules infused with compassion bend into something stronger, something lasting, justice that remembers the human soul. He knew there would always be critics, voices crying that mercy erodes the rule of law. But Caprio had seen too much to believe that mercy weakened justice. In his eyes, mercy was justice's guardian. Laws without compassion are cages. With compassion, they are bridges. And America, he believed to his last day on the bench, was always meant to be a bridge. As he gazed at Ziggy, he recognized in him the story of the ordinary American, the quiet, unsung resilience of those who work too hard for too little, who dream though the odds conspire against them. Ziggy was not exceptional because of his mistakes or his fines, but because of his dignity, despite them. And by forgiving his debts, Caprio had not erased the law. He had ennobled it. This was the moral. The greatness of a nation, any nation, is not measured by how harshly it disciplines its weakest, but by how compassionately it uplifts them. That moment in Providence became more than a clip, more than a trending hashtag. It became a parable, a reminder that justice, at its best, is not sterile procedure but living mercy. And the beauty was that this moral reached beyond politics, beyond party lines, beyond cultural divides. It landed in the hearts of people who understood struggle, instinctively, people who wanted their country to mirror their own values of generosity, kindness, and fairness. It was immigrant pride. It was working-class perseverance. It was Americanness distilled into a single act of grace. For Caprio, there was no grand farewell speech. His reflection was in the ruling itself, an act that reminded the world that compassion is not weakness, but courage. That tearing down is easy. Lifting up, especially in systems designed to grind down, is the real strength. So when Ziggy Quinn walked out that day, head bowed but heart unburdened, he carried more than his own dignity. He carried a legacy. He carried the proof that mercy could be louder than punishment, that humanity could cut through bureaucracy, that one man's empathy could ripple outward until it touched the globe. And the audience, both in that courtroom and the millions who would later watch online, felt something rare, catharsis. Tears that began with heartbreak ended in pride. Because amid cynicism, corruption, and division, here was evidence that justice could still be beautiful, that dignity could still triumph. Judge Frank Caprio's career ended not with a gavel's bang but with something quieter and more enduring, a softened voice, a mist of tears, and a decision that refused to let the law be cruel. And in that courtroom, Caprio gave us not just justice, but a blueprint for hope. It all came down to that final moment, the trembling voice of Ziggy Quinn, the steady compassion in Judge Frank Caprio's eyes, and the tears that filled the room as dignity triumphed over bureaucracy. This was more than the conclusion of a single case. It was the closing chapter of a career built on the belief that justice without mercy is hollow, and it left every witness with the same realization. Humanity has the power to transform the law. That is why this story will be told again and again, why the clip of Caprio's final ruling continues to echo across timelines and feeds. It's because, in a world too often hardened by division and cruelty, here was a moment where kindness was the loudest force in the room. A judge wept for a man the system would have ignored, and in doing so, reminded us all that compassion is not weakness. It is the highest form of strength. Now, the legacy belongs to us. The choice is ours, whether in classrooms, at workplaces, in families or communities, to choose compassion over indifference. To remember that behind every rule, every struggle, every statistic, there is a human being who longs to be seen with dignity, If you carry forward one lesson from Judge Caprio's farewell, let it be this. Mercy is not an exception to justice. Mercy is what makes justice whole. So share this story. Share your own moments where compassion won out over rules. And subscribe, not just to this channel, but to an idea. That together, we can build a movement where fairness and dignity are not rare miracles but everyday expectations. Because Judge Frank Caprio's story is not only his, it's ours, and it's still being written.